screen. Thank you for the recording. Okay. You all can see my screen just fine?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. So before we hop into the presentation, I would like to just kind of ask some questions to gauge where everybody's at. I know dispute resolution tends to come up a lot, and a lot of people have no clue what it is, slash are like experts on it. So I was just kind of wondering, by quick show of hands, how many people have any kind of experience with dispute resolution methods? Great. Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. So before I dive in, I do want to put out a really quick disclaimer that so I work for the BlueGreen Alliance, and this presentation does not reflect officially endorsed positions by the BlueGreen Alliance. This is my own education and background. So just to make sure to put that out there, this is not something the BlueGreen Alliance is publicly endorsing. So let's go ahead and get started. Yeah. Move this, right, good. Okay. Okay. So the first thought we have here is, why is dispute resolution important? These are a couple of just general ideas of why it's important to embed dispute resolution mechanisms into really any project you're working on. But when you come to a place where you have a lot of stakeholders, the process becomes increasingly important. Some of the highlights are to maintain positive relationships. So disputes, especially in CBAs, can definitely strain relationships between the developer and the community, and any other involved groups. So including mechanisms to, preserve positive relationships and create a structure for understanding how we're going to resolve disputes in the very beginning can save a lot of resources, money, resources and time, and really just keep the relationships flowing nicely. Another reason is to ensure agreement compliance. Excuse me. So when we talk about CBAs, a lot of people think about the things that the community is going to get, such as affordable housing, infrastructure improvements, or really whatever it is that the community wants. So adding dispute resolution methods can make sure, or, it plays a really crucial role in ensuring that compliance with the terms of the agreement is a priority. Because no matter what, we know a dispute is going to arise, and having clear, well-defined process for resolving them, it kind of keeps things just moving slowly and nicely. I'm not going to dive too much into the rest because they're pretty straightforward, balancing stakeholder interests, making sure that all involved parties have their priorities clear at the table. Minimizing litigation risks is something that's also very important, only because litigation can strain resources, damage relationships, delay project implementation. Nothing really good comes from out of getting to the point where we have to talk about litigation. So from the very beginning, having a clear, defined process can assist. Enhancing credibility and reputation, that's pretty straightforward. Moving on to the methods of conflict resolution. So before I dive into each one of these and what it really is, I do want to say that this is not necessarily one of those things that's it's a menu to choose one thing alone from. This is more of a suite of complementary methodologies that can work together to transform a conflict. So frequently, you'll see, for example, if we're in a meeting for the advisory team for a CBA, we will decide that, if a conflict comes up, we'll first have a facilitator. And if that doesn't work, then we get a mediator. And if that doesn't work, we get an arbitrator. And if that doesn't work, we go to litigation. So we kind of just create a process using whatever of these things and other methods that are the most appropriate for the type of conflict that arises. We'll just walk through each one of these pretty quickly. Mediation is it involves a neutral third party who facilitates the negotiations between the parties in a dispute. The mediator helps parties communicate, identify underlying interests, explore potential solutions. The most important thing to note here is that mediation is voluntary and non-binding. Next, we have arbitration, which is a little bit more of a formal process. It's the same. We have a neutral third party, and the third party reviews the evidence and the arguments presented by the parties to make a binding decision. The arbitrator's decision is typically based on the terms of the CBA and takes into account relevant laws as applicable. Litigation, as I was talking about earlier, this involves taking the dispute into court. And of course, as you all know, courts require a judge or a jury. The decision is binding, and there are resources that are going to need to be taken into account here. Facilitation is a little bit more mellow of a process. So when you have a facilitator, it's different than mediation because a facilitator is not necessarily focused on a specific dispute. The facilitator is more focused on the process versus mediation, where it's like, we have this one problem, help us figure out this one problem. A facilitator is here to kind of streamline the entire conversation. The facilitator's role is really to encourage collaboration, think about generating creative solutions. So yeah, in that sense, they're not like mediators where they're focused specifically on resolving an issue. The creation of an advisory board is something that I am personally always a fan of and strongly support in any type of scenario where there is a community and a developer, or really any different types of stakeholders. So the creation of the board is typically something included in the CBA, and the membership of the board is also usually pretty well defined if a board will be created. The board is usually to be composed of representatives of all stakeholders. So, you know, if we have like 5 different community groups, and that may include a faith-based group, you know, specific organizations that are that are topic specific, they all will have a seat at the table on the advisory board. And this is really, really great to keep the dialogue going and address issues as they come up before they can become a conflict. Negotiation, I left that to the end and almost didn't really want to bring it up because the whole entire process of a CBA is a negotiation, but I put it in here because we have to talk about negotiations. So negotiation is, generally speaking, direct and informal. It's a method where parties can engage in discussion. It can be direct between the parties, or it can include the assistance of a facilitator or a mediator. It really just depends on what the environment looks like, what the existing relationships look like. So moving on, I know I'm going through a lot, but this is my last slide and we'll open it up to questions. I wanted to mention a little bit about conflict prevention methodologies, which is, I feel like, something that doesn't get enough mention, really. So before we get to a conflict and figure out what we want to do with it, we can avoid it if possible. One of the best things to do to prevent a conflict is to really focus on transparency and clarity. So emphasizing the importance of clearly outlined methodologies for discussion, negotiation, dispute resolution. So in the very, very beginning, we say, okay, if a conflict arises, we are going to take steps 1, 2, and 3 to identify what the conflict is, to identify the positions of the stakeholders in this conflict, and then to work on figuring out a fair solution for everybody. So transparency and clarity, very, very important. Early engagement. I'm an advocate of early engagement in the dispute resolution process only because it encourages parties to continuously discuss any potential conflicts as they arise. Not really a whole lot to discuss here other than, tackle it early. Don't wait until it festers. And these types of relationships between communities, developers, unions, public officials, whoever it is, at the end of the day, we're all still people and they're still all just relationships. The last thing I want to talk about is kind of a win-win tailored solution that is an option for everyone. When we're going into these types of agreements, if we can early on kind of have a quick discussion about fostering a problem solving mindset and encouraging compromise, encouraging parties to achieve resolutions that satisfy all of the stakeholders involved, as long as we're approaching it from that mindset, we can tailor all of the solutions that we come up with to make sure that it's a one size fits all, or it is something that is appropriate per stakeholder area of priority. So we can adapt the methods to make sure that everybody gets what they want. And that's the beauty of having such a easygoing type of agreement. And I don't mean easy as in easy to negotiate. I mean easy as in tailored. And I will end there. I know I talked at you for a while there. That's the end of my talking at you, and I'm going to open it up to questions. And stop sharing my screen. Oh, that would be great if everything I talked through is so clear and easy to get through, no questions at all. That's great. I see one question. Go ahead to Bren Martin.
Hi, I'm in northeastern Kentucky. I was just wondering, how do you talked about win-win, and very seldomly, I would imagine, do you have equal wins? So, how do you keep one side from having like a big win and the other side from having like a little win? And while we're touting a win-win scenario, and how do you do that without jeopardizing trust and transparency?
Thank you. That's such an important question. Um, a couple of ideas come to mind immediately. I would say 99% of the time, the underlying interests are usually pretty opposing. So if we give it an actual scenario, let's say a developer does not want to put that much money into affordable housing, the community is directly 100% interested in affordable housing, and how do we really figure out how to resolve that conflict with a win-win? That's when I would say negotiating different interests comes into play. So the developer would be willing to give in on this specific area if something else is not necessarily given up by the community, but offered, in the sense that, all right, well, if you play nice with us this time, and we can create affordable housing this time, then perhaps you can take on another project and we'll support your next project, versus we're going to fight you tooth and nail and you're not going to, develop anything in this community for the next 100 years. So I think what I'm really getting at here is finding the right leverage. And that is really where you can get to a win-win. So to clarify, win-win doesn't necessarily mean we walk away all being best friends. Frequently we walk away with some hard feelings, especially when it comes to big money and big politics. What I'm really getting at with this is finding the right leverage. And that is usually when community groups, including labor unions, faith-based organization, and neighborhood associations, really any stakeholders that have authority and power in the community, come together and figure out, this is the power that we have, this is the leverage that we have, and this is the type of ask we can make that can get us somewhere. Did I answer your question?
Yes, that was good. Thank you.
Right. Any other questions?
So this is Steve Herzenberg. I mean, this may not be a fair question in this workshop. I mean, I joined because probably with a kind of more informal notion of dispute resolution in mind, but also with the issue of community and labor in mind. Not just the developer, versus the community or different stakeholders. So I just again, it seems that one of the challenges, at least in some places, is the relationship between community members and labor. So again, I don't know whether I don't know whether you feel able, based on experience or your background, able to offer any kind of perspective on that.
Sure. I just want to make sure I understand your question clearly. So you're asking about the potential different positions when it comes to labor unions and labor organizations in a community, and the community organizations themselves, if they have differing positions on something.
Well, yeah, I can give you a specific. I mean, I can give you a specific example. One of the speakers yesterday, Carl Redwood from Pittsburgh, talked about a community benefits agreement in 2008-9 in Pittsburgh, and he actually said in passing, may have been on his PowerPoint or the chat or something, he said that the building trades unions weren't part of that. I know they weren't part of that because they regarded that CBA as SEIU giving away, promising, their jobs to other people. And now Pittsburgh's a bit different now. I mean, there's a pretty good apprenticeship readiness program. There's a guy who was an operating engineer who's the training director there. It's now housed in the Western Pennsylvania Builders Guild, but but the process of, the facilitating that conversation, when people's, well, frankly, if you're being honest, a lot of concrete situations, the starting point preconceptions of the two parties are not very positive. For example, the members of the community think that of the unions as, racist, and then sometimes the white trade unionist views of the minority community are as negative. So,
well, thank you for that question. That's a really important question, and I think what we're talking about really here is two different questions. And the first question that I'm understanding from you is conflict within communities and labor, and the second question is conflicts within labor and labor. So for the first question, conflicts between community and labor, I would say that is actually healthy and actually to be expected. As far as what to do about it, I would answer in a similar way, not about leverage, not about anything like that, because in that sense, we're on the same team. We want the same things from the developer. And when it comes to figuring out how to align interests, I would say this really just comes down to dialogue. Frequently, unions have a very specific set of interests and are not usually very willing to change positions on those specific identified interests, especially when it comes to CBAs or working with the community. And there's a lot of other things at play when it comes to unions being involved, which could include their political relationships, potential organizing efforts they're involved in. And when it comes to all of that, I would say you want to just engage in dialogue. Sometimes it's not fruitful, but I wish I had a better answer for you, Steve, when it came to that. Unions are going to have disagreements, they're going to have their positions, but I think that's a part of their role and a part of why they need to be there. So if there is the reputation of a union being racist, for example, or a union not being as productive, or a union not protecting its members the way that it should, I would strongly urge that that union still needs to be at the table, because, you know, the same argument that I would have for people who are on the red side of politics, if you alienate them and you push them away, all you're really doing is strengthening their position in opposing you versus engaging them and really trying to iron out and find commonalities. That's what I would strongly urge, is finding the commonalities. The, you know, like one of the speakers earlier this morning mentioned, everybody that's involved is gonna want the benefits versus like how we do them, or if unions amongst themselves are getting involved in jurisdictional issues, that's for the unions to figure out. So that's the first part of the answer. The second part of the answer, when it comes to discussions between unions themselves, I come from a long history of working for unions and with unions, and I would strongly urge anyone who is not, if you don't need to be a part of that conversation, don't be a part of that conversation. That would be my first advice. Is, you know, if the building trades and the, you know, I don't know, IBEW are having a jurisdictional conversation, that is for them to figure out. As a third party, you're not going to win, and you're not going to be able to contribute something useful to their jurisdictional conversation. What I would urge, though, is as a neutral third party when it comes to a conversation between unions, is stand strong and remember your leverage and your ground, right? Like if a union is being accused of being racist in its selection of apprentices to go into an apprenticeship program, there might be truth there. And that's not to say that that can't change. Unions are structures like any other structures in a community. And I think they're my favorite structure because accountability is very possible, and leadership turnover sometimes is required. Not to go too far into it, but I come from one of my very first jobs. I worked for a union that was incredibly racist and did not put the, you know, benefit of the members before the benefit of the leadership, which was really more interested in political ties and furthering themselves as an organization versus furthering the interests of the members when it came to local politics. That shifted eventually, took a long time, but it shifted. The members basically overthrew the leadership, but it started from calling them out and saying that they're being racist and that they're not using the resources of the union as they should to defend the membership. So I would say if those conversations are happening, they should be. You know, the strengthening of the labor movement has to come from that position. And my advice to all of us who are not in the middle of the conversation is don't get in the middle of the conversation. If you're already in it, though, I would say make sure to very clearly support your position as an individual who is a supporter of the labor movement overall, not a supporter of one union or a supporter of a jurisdictional fight. I talked a lot. I don't know if I actually answered your question.
My question was mostly about the first issue, and no, your answer was very helpful. I mean, the second one, actually, what you said, there's jurisdictional issues in solar. right now that are being worked out or not worked out on the ground in different places, and you know, IBW has part of this project and the laboring is non-union, and the laborers have part of this project and the electrical work is non-union. Like,
yeah, and we're gonna face it a lot, I think, especially in new industries. Like we're looking at a lot of the new green industries, we're gonna face jurisdictional questions and concerns that are going to be among unions, and that's for unions to figure out. They have a very clear process through the AFL where they can claim jurisdiction. If it's not a union that's registered or affiliated with the AFL, if they're changed to win, if they're another federation, that they also have a clear process. So that's for them to figure out.
I mean, on the first question, I mean, I'm sort of part of what there are all these toolkits, but it feels like, and it feels like the toolkits are mostly about the interaction. Well, they're about building the coalition to some extent, but they're mostly about the interaction with the developer and that negotiation. So that like concrete examples of a, I mean, again, your basic advice, which makes perfect sense, is you gotta have the conversation. But sort of in terms of examples of processes, or something that helped the dam burst in a good way, or I mean part of what's happening, again, I'm talking a lot based on Pittsburgh experience and generational change, is taking care of things to some extent. So Pittsburgh's in a much better place now. I mean, again, it's got a good mayor, or at least a labor and community friendly mayor, and then it's probably going to have a county executive in Allegheny County who's a very progressive young woman, so, and very pro labor and very green, and so fingers crossed, we're really optimistic about Pittsburgh and Allegheny County being able to do good work in this space, in the next few years. Yeah, but it's still, I just wish I knew a few more concrete stories or examples of how things, change. I mean, as I think about it, the stories I know, I mean, for example, I know a little bit about Milwaukee and the Wisconsin Regional Training Partnership Big Step, and how, but again, it just, well, it ends up being, you had a combination of critical skilled leaders.
Yeah.
The secretary treasurer of the Wisconsin AFL, the left-wing academic, the graduate student who had practical and organizing as well as analytical skills, and the Earl Buford, that black guy who was running the already the pre-apprenticeship program, whatever. And they did the relationship thing, but and got the trades to own the pre-employment training work that. But anyway, I'm looking for a cookie cutter, and maybe there's no cookie.
I don't want to interrupt.
Go ahead, Dan.
I just saw somebody come off mute, so I just wanted to make sure somebody didn't have a question.
Sorry.
Well, while our somebody gathers their thoughts, I quickly want to say to Steve, I don't I think what you're looking for exists. I don't think it's out of the question. I think it's just because the idea of CBAs excuse me, is so different everywhere it's implemented, because it 100% depends on the stakeholders, the local politicians. The developer could be behaving one way in one CBA, and literally the same developer could be behaving the complete opposite way in a different CBA in a different community, based on the strength of the community. I mean, imagine a community like Detroit, for example, with strong labor, strong community, just strong history of owning their shit. Sorry, excuse me. Just strong history of being a community, versus you go somewhere where it's a newer community, not a whole lot of community investment going on from the people itself. The developer is going to get away with a lot. So I think what you're looking for does exist. It's just finding it. And if that's what the issue is, I'm happy to work with you offline and track down some resources.
Cool. Thank you.
Of course. I did see Dan's comment in the chat about internal conflicts within a coalition. I do want to talk about this because this is so important. So when we talk about presenting the position of a coalition to the developer, internally, the coalition really does need to have the discussion of, okay, how are we going to make choices? How are we going to prioritize things? So the same process goes directly, it's applicable. The process of figuring out, do we want to have a facilitator? Do we want to have a mediator? Especially if different organizations within the coalition have opposing views about something, like we should build a park here. No, we should not build the park here. It should be a parking lot. I don't know. So if it's specifically very opposing views, I would strongly urge making sure we have enough resources to get a facilitator or a mediator at that point, not necessarily an arbitrator, unless it's something that is really detrimental issue that we're not being able to figure out together. But what I would urge is resolve this conflict internally between the coalition and do not bring it to the table with the developer, right? Like when the coalition comes to the table, the developer, they need to have one united position, because the developer will 100% exploit the fact there is division within the coalition. Yeah, that's it. Any other fun questions? Wow, you guys are a really well-informed group.
Okay, I'll take a stab at it. Thank you for trying to answer that question. That was a very good one, and it was kind of centered around a dilemma I'm having, and was wondering the solution to. How do you deal with similar to what was just expressed, but like it's people don't want to bring it out to the open. So, for example, if you're having a conflict with someone and um, you mention it, it seems as though people get defensive and the people with the most influence tend to just leave you out. I mean, it's easy to just exclude the so-called troublemaker, or the problem bringer upper. And and sometimes even flip it to make it seem like you're the one with the problem. So how do you deal with that? Mm.
Oh, I love this question, because this question is appropriate and applicable literally to every level of conflict, right? Like you can be fighting your partner and have this issue, or you can be the US and Russia and have this issue. It's applicable at every level. And what I would say, step one, which is always step one, and it just escapes people because it's, unless you're literally trained in conflict resolution, it's not something that you think about. So I would say step one is get both people to agree on what the conflict is. And I know that this seems ridiculous, and it seems like, okay, well, we're already fighting, so we know what the conflict is. I can guarantee you 99% of the time, you don't. So for example, I'll give you an actual live example. My partner and I were having a conversation last night. He thought I was taking a specific position. I was not. And we had this whole conflict around him thinking I was taking a specific position, but I wasn't. He was hearing what he wanted to hear. So when we finally figured out, like, okay, what is our actual conflict right now? It is that I have this position and you have this position. Okay, now we know this is how you feel, this is how I feel, and we're going to mirror it back to each other. I'm going to tell you that I think this is what you're saying, so therefore I'm going to respond to that. Then you're going to tell me what you think I'm saying, and that's what you will respond to. So not to overkill it, but step one is always agree on what the conflict is. Step two, once you get both parties to say, okay, this is the conflict, then you get both parties to say, this is my position. And I know that this also seems like it's a little bit ridiculous and like child's play, but I promise you it is so effective. So this is my conflict, this is my position. And then step three is, this is what I want. By the time you get to step three of like, okay, we agree that this is the issue. Step two, we agree that this is my position. And step three is, this is what I want. By the time you get there, 99% of conflicts are already resolved. And if it is not resolved by this point, then I would say it's time to bring in a facilitator or mediator if you cannot continue to have the conversation of like, okay, well, where can you give in a little bit? Where can I give in a little bit? Where can we meet in the middle? If that doesn't automatically kind of trickle out once you get to step three, and you kind of face like a stalemate, then I would say, okay, at this point, you know what, like if in my personal relationships I get there, I say it's time for a pause. We need to both cool off and really get level-headed and think about what we actually really want here. If it's more of like community organizations, the US and Russia, you don't necessarily take time to cool off. It's more about really, really figuring out your priorities. And at that point, you bring in a neutral third party. Does that answer your question, Bren? Yes. Okay, cool. Any other questions? Seeing none, I'm going to give it another minute or so for folks to think about questions, but if not, we can take a quick break. I know we're in a summit all day long, so we can take a break till our next session. So I'm going to give it a last round of thoughts, questions, comments, anything. Say hi to my cat Nova. She's just hanging out. Okay, well, I think seems like we've covered everything. If not, feel free to contact me outside of the presentation. I'm always happy to support and help when it comes to conflict resolution methodologies. And I would say let's take a break.
Thank you so much. This was great.
You're welcome. Thank you.